Nobody breathed. Not the bishops near the door. Not the countesses frozen mid-whisper behind their fans. Not even the violinists, who had been halfway through a waltz when the music simply died, as if the instruments themselves understood that something irreversible was about to happen. The grand ballroom of Versailles had hosted 1,000 scandals over the centuries. It had seen crowns topple, alliances shatter, and perfectly good men ruin themselves for the wrong reasons. But tonight, on the very evening that was supposed to celebrate the engagement blessing of Duke Alfred and Vivian Miller, it was about to witness something far more quiet and far more devastating than any of those. It was about to watch a man step away from the woman who loved him most. Duke Alfred moved backward, just one deliberate step, and the entire room felt it like a tremor beneath the floor. He did not stumble. He did not hesitate. He moved the way men move when they have already rehearsed the decision 100 times in their heads and simply arrived at the moment of execution. Cold, precise, final. Vivian Miller stood beneath the gilded arch that had been decorated with hundreds of ivory roses for this occasion. Her cream gown, embroidered with delicate gold thread, caught the candlelight from every angle. Her dark hair was swept up, pinned beneath a brilliant tiara that her mother had worn on her own wedding day. She looked extraordinary. She looked exactly like a woman whose life was beginning. But her face, her face told a different story. She had gone completely pale, the kind of pale that sets in when the body understands something before the mind is caught up. A single tear slid down her cheek, and she did not wipe it. She kept her chin lifted. She kept her eyes steady. She gave the watching court absolutely nothing to mock. The rumors had moved through the crowd like smoke through a keyhole, fast, shapeless, impossible to stop. Intercepted letters, secret meetings, the scandalous, ugly suggestion that Vivian Miller had been conducting a hidden romance with a married prince while her engagement to Alfred was still standing. Nobody had proof. Nobody needed proof. In high society, a whisper loud enough becomes its own kind of verdict. Alfred's jaw was set, his dark coat, heavy with gold embroidery and the royal star pinned above his heart, made him look exactly like what he was, a man of tremendous power and zero mercy. His gaze swept over Vivian, the way you look at a problem you have already decided how to solve. "I cannot bind my family name," he said, with a voice so quiet and so controlled that it carried across the entire silent ballroom. "To scandal." 5 words. That was all. No question. No private conversation. No moment where he pulled her aside and whispered, "Tell me the truth. I need to hear it from you." Nothing. Just 5 words, delivered like a sentence from the bench, while 500 witnesses stood watching to see if she would fall apart. She did not fall apart. Vivian Miller slowly reached up, slipped the diamond engagement ring from her finger, the one Alfred had placed there himself just 6 weeks ago, on a quiet evening when he had told her she was the only steady thing in his otherwise turbulent world, and set it onto the silver tray beside her with a sound so sharp and so final that several women in the crowd flinched. "I understand, Your Grace." She curtsied, gracefully, perfectly, as though she were simply completing a formal introduction at a dinner party. And then she walked out, through the crowd that parted for her like water, through the towering golden doors, out into the rain, which had begun falling some time earlier and had not let up since, as if the sky had known what was coming and started grieving ahead of the rest of them. She carried no defense. She offered no explanation. She left the room holding a secret so enormous, so dangerous, that if it had ever come to light that evening, the man who had just publicly humiliated her would have spent the rest of his life on his knees begging for her forgiveness. But she didn't tell him. She never told him. And that choice, that single, staggering act of silent loyalty, was about to cost her absolutely everything. "Hey, quick question. How are you feeling right now? Because if Vivian's walk out of that ballroom already has your heart in your throat, you are exactly where this story needs you to be. Thank you for being here. It genuinely means the world. Stories like this one only reach people because of you. Your subscriptions, your likes, your comments. So if this story is already pulling at your heart, please hit that subscribe button, smash the like, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is traveling. It helps more than you know. All right. Thank you. Now let's get back to Vivian. The night she walked out of Versailles, Vivian did not cry until she was inside the carriage with the curtains drawn and the horses moving through the dark, rain-soaked streets of Paris. Then, and only then, did she press both hands against her mouth and let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened. She had not been caught in an affair. She had not exchanged love letters with the prince. She had never looked at any man the way she had looked at Alfred, with that particular mixture of admiration and trust and the terrifying willingness to be completely known by another person. What she had done that had set the entire scandal in motion had begun 6 weeks earlier, on a night when Adrian had appeared at her father's door looking like a man who had already seen his own death sentence. Adrian, Alfred's younger brother, charming, careless, 23 years old and perpetually convinced that the world was arranged specifically for his amusement. Vivian had known him for 2 years and had liked him in the distant way you like a firecracker entertaining from a safe distance, genuinely alarming up close. He had come to her trembling. "I have done something," he said, and his voice had been so stripped of its usual bravado that she barely recognized it. "Something that will destroy Alfred, destroy all of us, unless someone fixes it." He explained it in pieces, his hand shaking the entire time. He had been drawn into a circle of younger noblemen who fancied themselves political visionaries, men who spent late nights in private clubs discussing the crown's weaknesses and occasionally signing their names to documents they should never have touched. One of those documents, it turned out, contained language that the crown's legal advisers would classify without hesitation as treason, and Adrian's name was on it, in his own handwriting, alongside the signature of a prince who was now very eager to make the whole mess disappear quietly. The prince had reached out through indirect channels. He was willing to bury the document to make it vanish from any official record, but he needed something in return. He needed a distraction, something that would occupy the court's attention entirely, something scandalous enough that no investigator would bother looking any deeper. He needed a story, and Vivian, already engaged to Adrian's brother, already embedded in the highest social circles, already a woman whose reputation was pristine enough that any fall from grace would generate maximum fascination. Vivian was, in the most clinical and terrible sense, the perfect candidate. She had sat with that information for 3 days. She had thought about telling Alfred. She had picked up her pen 4 times to write him a letter. Each time, she stopped, because she knew Alfred, and she knew what he would do. He would confront the prince directly. He would demand answers through official channels. He would act with the rigid, uncompromising honor that she loved and feared in equal measure, and within a week the treason charge would be formalized. Adrian would be on trial, and the de Vera name, the name she was about to take as her own, would be pulled apart in court. So she made the choice herself, without telling anyone, without asking for permission. She met with the prince twice, briefly, in public gardens at hours when being seen was inevitable. She kept both conversations entirely formal. She had negotiated, firmly and without flinching, for Adrian's name to be removed from every copy of the document, in exchange for allowing the rumor of a romance to circulate unchallenged. The prince agreed. He preferred gossip. It made him seem more interesting than dangerous, which suited him perfectly. The rumor spread exactly as planned. The Crown's investigators, as anticipated, found the affair scandal far more entertaining than any dry political inquiry. Nobody dug deeper. Nobody connected the meetings to anything larger than vanity and desire. Adrian was safe. The family was safe. And Alfred never asked her a single question. That was the part that kept her awake that night in the rain-soaked carriage, listening to her own heartbeat. Not the public humiliation, not the court stares, not even the cold precision of Alfred's voice when he spoke those 5 words. It was the silence before them. 6 weeks of rumors, and he had never once come to her privately and said, "I need to understand this. I need to hear your side." He had watched the whispers grow, weighed them against the political risk to his family, and made a calculation. She had already decided before she set foot in that ballroom. She understood something then, sitting in the dark carriage, that she had not fully understood before. The thing she had sacrificed herself to protect Alfred's family, Alfred's name, Alfred's future had always been more real to Alfred than she was. She cried quietly for exactly 20 minutes. Then she straightened up, dried her eyes, and began planning her next step. Back at his estate, Alfred had arrived home to find Adrian waiting in the entrance hall with relief painted so obviously across his face that it should have been a warning. Adrian's shoulders had dropped the moment Alfred walked in. His breathing had steadied. He had looked, in the most uncomfortable way, like a man who had just watched someone else take a punishment meant for him. Alfred noticed it, filed it away, said nothing. He went to his study, sat at his desk, and stared at the wall for an hour. He told himself he had made the right decision. He told himself that a man in his position could not afford to let sentiment override strategy. He told himself that Vivian would recover, that the court would move on to the next scandal, that this was simply the cost of protecting what mattered. None of those thoughts quieted the image in his mind of her face at the moment he stepped back. That pale, composed, heartbroken face. The way she had looked at him once, just once, with an expression that wasn't anger, wasn't hatred, but something far worse. Forgiveness. She had already forgiven him before he had finished speaking, and he did not understand, then, how completely that would haunt him. Vivian's cousin Grace arrived at her family's townhouse the following morning with the energy of someone who had not slept and had spent the night rehearsing arguments. "You have to fight this," Grace said, sitting across from Vivian at the breakfast table with untouched tea going cold between them. "Tell them the truth. Tell someone. Write it down. Send it to the Queen. Do something." Vivian looked at her cousin with great affection and great weariness. Grace was 20 years old and still believed that the world rewarded honesty. It was one of the most beautiful things about her. "If I tell the truth," Vivian said carefully, "Adrian hangs. His name is on a document that would put him before a crown tribunal. Alfred loses his brother and spends the next decade recovering from the political fallout. The scandal I manufactured to prevent that outcome becomes 1,000 times worse the moment anyone understands what it was actually covering." Grace stared at her. "So you burn yourself alive to keep everyone else warm?" Vivian was quiet for a moment. "I didn't burn. I walked away. It looks the same from the outside. It doesn't feel the same from the inside." Grace left 2 hours later, still unhappy, still unpersuaded, and Vivian sat alone at the window and watched the street below, where life was continuing exactly as it always had, entirely indifferent to the fact that her own had just been taken apart at the seams. She gave herself 3 days to grieve. Then she packed her trunks, said goodbye to her father, and left Paris entirely. 3 years is a long time to live inside a mistake. Duke Alfred learned this the way you learn most important lessons, gradually, and then all at once. The first year after Vivian's departure, he told himself the discomfort was simply adjustment. Change was uncomfortable. He had made a necessary decision, and necessary decisions came with their own particular aftertaste. The second year, he stopped using the word uncomfortable and started using the word haunted, though strictly to himself, in the privacy of his own thoughts, when no one could hear him admit that a man of his standing had been undone by a single image of a pale woman in a cream gown, placing a diamond ring onto a silver tray with the quiet composure of someone who had already accepted the outcome before it arrived. By the third year, he had simply become colder. Paris noticed, in the way Paris always notices. The Duke had become more powerful, certainly. The Crown trusted him with matters of increasing sensitivity. Noble families angled for his favor at every gathering. Women watched him from across rooms with a slightly unnerving admiration reserved for men who have mastered the art of perfect blankness. But he never danced. He never lingered at dinners. He never laughed the easy, unguarded laugh that Vivian alone had once managed to produce, usually by saying something so precise and so unexpected that it bypassed his defenses entirely before he had time to raise them. He rode alone in the evenings, long, unnecessary rides through the city, always ending through some geography of guilt. He refused to examine too closely somewhere in the vicinity of whatever social event Vivian had last been rumored to attend, 3 years ago, before she vanished. Adrian had changed too, though his change was less obviously legible. He had grown quieter. The easy confidence was still there in public, the charming smile, the elegant small talk, but something behind his eyes had shifted. He watched his brother sometimes with an expression that sat uncomfortably between guilt and relief, and whenever Alfred looked back at him directly, Adrian always looked away first. Alfred noticed. Still said nothing. There was a particular winter waltz he associated with Vivian, an old melody the orchestra played every year at the King's annual masquerade, and he had made it his private practice to be elsewhere in the building when it played. This, more than anything, was the detail he would never have admitted to anyone. The Duke of Devereux, navigating ballrooms to avoid a song. The night of the King's masquerade that third winter, Alfred was standing near the palace balcony, watching snow fall beyond the glass, half listening to a countess describing her recent travels to Florence. He was politely present. He was mentally absent. He was doing the thing he had become very good at, performing a version of himself, while the actual version sat somewhere quieter and considerably less functional. Then the music changed. A ripple moved through the crowd, that particular kind of wave that moves through a room when something worth looking at has arrived, and Alfred turned toward the grand staircase, without meaning to. She was wearing silver silk, to be precise, with a sweep of the fabric that caught the candlelight as she descended, and a kind of cold, deliberate grace in her posture that suggested she was not only aware of every eye in the room, but had decided, in advance, exactly how much she was willing to give them. She looked extraordinary. She looked like 3 years of living well, and refusing to apologize for it had been very, very good to her. She looked utterly indifferent to his existence. Alfred's pulse did something ungentlemanly and disorganized at her side, and this was the detail that arrived like a slow, deliberate punch to the sternum, was a man Alfred did not recognize. Tall, refined, the kind of easy, open warmth in his bearing that Alfred had always found vaguely suspicious in other men, and tonight found outright infuriating. His hand rested against Vivian's back with the unconscious confidence of someone who was accustomed to being exactly where he was. Henry. Alfred would learn his name within the hour from 3 separate sources, all of them entirely too eager to deliver the information. Henry, a diplomat from Vienna. Henry, who spoke 4 languages and had impeccable taste and was, by every account Alfred heard that evening, deeply, genuinely, uncomplicatedly fond of Vivian Miller. The Queen herself rose slightly from her seat to greet Vivian. The same society that had watched Vivian leave in scandal 3 years ago was now reaching for her favor, like a collection of people who had lost something valuable and only realized it long after they had thrown it away. Vivian accepted all of it with the same equanimity, gracious, warm to those who deserved it, perfectly, maddeningly composed. She did not look at Alfred once. He crossed the ballroom at some point in the evening. He would later be unable to explain precisely what calculation led him there, and approached her during a brief moment when Henry was engaged in conversation nearby. "Lady Miller," he said. She turned. Her expression didn't change. "Your Grace." 2 words. Title only. The distance between them was absolute. He said something about the lake at Shepherd's Hill, which she had always loved in winter. She replied in the past tense. He mentioned the winter carriage rides they had once shared. She replied in the past tense. He told her she looked well. She thanked him with the exact degree of warmth she would have used with a distant acquaintance she had once met at a dinner party and barely remembered. Then she said it, quietly, calmly, as if it were a minor piece of news. "Henry and I are engaged. We will be moving to Vienna in the spring." Alfred stood very still. Henry appeared at her shoulder moments later, offered his arm, and led her to the dance floor with a smile that managed to be both entirely polite and, somehow, completely devastating. Alfred watched them dance, and for the first time in 3 years, fear entered his chest, not the fear of political consequence or social scandal, but the raw, specific terror of a man who had spent 3 years assuming there was still time to correct a mistake, and was only now beginning to understand that time had, at some point, run out. Winter settled into Paris like a guest who had overstayed its welcome and refused to notice. The city was heavy with snow, and Alfred was heavy with something considerably less poetic. He attended every gathering at which Vivian was present, not by coincidence, not by design he would acknowledge to anyone, but with the helpless momentum of a man being pulled somewhere by a current he hadn't noticed until he was already deep in it. He watched Henry. He watched the way Henry listened to her, not politely, not with the half-attention of a man waiting for his turn to speak, but with genuine interest, leaning slightly forward, his eyes on her face, as if what she was saying was the most important information available to him at any given moment. Alfred recognized this, because he had once done it himself. He had stopped, somewhere along the way, without noticing, and now someone else was doing it in his place. At Lady Whitmore's private musical evening, a gathering Alfred had attended solely because Vivian's name was on the guest list, which was something he was now doing with depressing regularity. He watched Vivian, seated near the grand piano, the candlelight doing something extraordinary to her silver gown, while 3 different gentlemen orbited her conversation circle with the eager, slightly helpless energy of men who understood they were outclassed but couldn't quite bring themselves to leave. A young viscount, the sort of man who was all confidence and no substance, the sort that Vivian would have seen through in approximately 45 seconds, was leaning too close and laughing too loudly, and occasionally touching the sleeve of her gown with the kind of casual familiarity that required either an existing intimacy or a complete misreading of the room. Alfred crossed the room before he had made a decision to do so. "Apologies," he said, arriving at the Viscount's elbow with the particular tone of voice that he used when he was being polite in a way that contained an unmistakable subtext. "Lady Miller and I had something to discuss." The Viscount read the subtext correctly and excused himself with slightly more speed than grace. Vivian looked at Alfred with an expression that was equal parts unsurprised and unimpressed. He was harmless. He was annoying. "I don't recall asking for your editorial opinion on my company." There was a brief silence between them, during which the music played softly and the rest of the room pretended not to watch. "You seemed uncomfortable," he said, which was not entirely true, and they both knew it. "I was perfectly comfortable. You were uncomfortable." She said this with such complete, unruffled accuracy that for a moment Alfred had absolutely nothing to say. "Is there something you actually needed, Your Grace? Or did you simply want to remind the Viscount that you have better posture?" Alfred almost smiled. He didn't. "The court talks," he said, which was both true and beside the point, and he knew it even as he said it. The faint warmth that had briefly entered her expression at his near smile disappeared entirely. "The court talked about me for 3 years," she said quietly. "While I was absent, I can manage what they say while I'm present." Alfred looked at the floor, then back at her. "I searched for you," he said, "after you left." Vivian looked at him for a long, measuring moment. Something moved behind her eyes, not softness, but the memory of where softness used to live. "You searched after you abandoned me in public." "Yes." "Then the order of those 2 things should tell you something." Henry arrived before Alfred could respond, smooth and unhurried, with the ease of a man who was entirely secure in exactly where he stood. "Lady Miller, your carriage is ready when you are." She nodded. She looked back at Alfred once. "Good night, Your Grace." He watched her leave. He stood in the middle of Lady Whitmore's drawing room for what felt like an unreasonable amount of time, holding a glass of wine he hadn't touched, aware of at least 4 people watching him do it. His friend James materialized beside him with the energy of a man who had been waiting for the right moment and had decided this was it. "You know," James said carefully, "most men, when they are attempting to demonstrate dignity, do not do it by standing alone in the middle of a room, staring at the door someone just walked through." Alfred looked at him. "I am considering my next move." "She's engaged, Alfred." "I am aware." She looked happy. "I am aware of that as well." James was quiet for a moment. Then, carefully, "What are you actually trying to accomplish?" Alfred had no answer for that, not one he was prepared to say out loud. He set his glass down, straightened his coat, and left. Back at his estate, Alfred sat in his study long after midnight. The fire had burned down to embers. The house was completely quiet except for the wind moving through the trees outside and the distant sound of Adrian's footsteps pacing in the room directly above. Adrian had been pacing more frequently. Alfred had noticed it. I had been noticing it for weeks. That strange, coiled anxiety his brother was carrying the way he started slightly whenever the post arrived, the way he had quietly declined every invitation to attend any event at which royal officials might be present, the look on his face the night Vivian walked out. Alfred filed all of this away in the quiet part of his mind where uncomfortable questions lived while he decided what to do about them. He was not yet ready to open that door, but he was, increasingly, aware that it existed. The Royal Opera season's most anticipated performance fell on the coldest night Paris had seen in a decade. Snow had been falling since mid-afternoon, and by the time carriages began arriving at the theater, the cobblestones were sheeted in ice and the wind was conducting itself with the aggressive energy of something with a personal vendetta. Inside, the theater was warm and golden and magnificently indifferent to the weather. Alfred arrived alone, as he had arrived at most things that season. He found his seat, exchanged the necessary pleasantries with the family in the adjacent box, and spent the first act watching the stage with genuine concentration, and the second act pretending to watch the stage while actually watching the box 2 tiers below, where Vivian sat beside Henry in a gown the color of deep winter sky. Henry leaned toward her during a particularly moving aria and said something quiet. She smiled. Alfred looked back at the stage with the focused intensity of a man determined to be interested in opera. The storm worsened during the third act. By the time the performance ended and the audience began filing toward the exits, the wind had become something serious, and servants were rushing between carriages and doorways with the harried energy of people managing a situation that was escalating faster than anticipated. Alfred stepped outside just as he heard the sharp crack of splintering wood. One of the carriage wheels, Vivian's carriage, he realized immediately had shattered against a raised ice-covered cobblestone. The horses were agitated. Servants were trying to calm them. Henry was already assessing the wheel with calm practicality, and Vivian was standing to one side with her cloak pulled tight against the wind, snow gathering in her hair. Alfred moved without thinking. "Take mine," he said, appearing beside her. "My driver knows the road. The carriage is heated." Henry looked up from the wheel. A very specific kind of silence passed between the two men, the kind that contained an entire conversation in the space of 3 seconds. "I can arrange another," Henry began. "The roads are icing. It will take an hour to find a replacement carriage in this weather, and you know it." Alfred kept his voice level. His eyes moved to Vivian. It would be impractical to wait. Henry looked at Vivian for a long moment. Something passed between them, a quiet, private language of two people who understood each other well enough not to require many words. Then Henry nodded once, reached out, and touched her cheek briefly. "I'll follow on horseback. Go." She pressed her hand over his for a moment. Then she turned and walked toward Alfred's carriage without looking at him. Alfred found this somehow more difficult to watch than the smile. The carriage moved through the storm-struck streets, and the silence inside it had a texture and a temperature all its own. The lantern light was low and warm and made everything feel dangerously intimate, the kind of intimacy that arrives not by design but by situation, and which nobody has any graceful way to address. Vivian sat across from him with her cloak still wrapped around her shoulders, watching the snow-blurred street outside the window. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "The roads were dangerous." "That is not what I mean." He knew that. He said nothing. "You have been appearing," she said quietly, still looking out the window. "At every gathering, in every room. It isn't subtle, Alfred." The use of his name rather than his title was the first breach in the formal wall she had maintained since her return. He noticed it immediately and understood that she probably noticed him noticing it. "He would never humiliate you," Alfred said. The words came out with more bitterness than he intended. "Henry, he would never do what I did." She turned from the window and looked at him directly. The pain in her eyes was not hidden. She wasn't hiding it anymore. She simply wasn't performing it for him either. "No," she said. "He would not." Alfred looked away. The carriage rocked gently. Snow pressed against the glass. "I made a mistake," he said. "Yes. I should have asked you." "Yes, Vivian. Remaining near you," she said, and her voice was very quiet and very clear, "hurt more than leaving." The carriage jolted suddenly into a deep crack in the frozen road, and she pitched sideways. Alfred caught her before she struck the wall, his arm around her waist, her hand flat against his chest, to steady herself. For one suspended, painful moment, they were very close, and the space between them was full of everything that had no solution. She pulled back almost immediately, straightening, rebuilding the composure. "Thank you," she said. Formal again. The wall backed up. They did not speak again until the carriage stopped at her estate gates. She stepped down without taking his offered hand, paused for a moment in the snow. I looked back at him once. I hope you find what you are looking for, Alfred, she said. I genuinely do, but I will not be available to help you find it. Then she walked through the gates, and the snow closed around her like a curtain. Alfred sat in the stationary carriage for a very long time. He went home and did not sleep. The sentence she had delivered in the carriage moved through him with the precision of something that had been waiting years to find the right moment to land. Remaining near you hurt more than leaving. Not a weapon, not an accusation, just a plain, honest fact, offered without cruelty, and somehow that made it sharper than either would have been. He sat in his study until the fire died and the cold came in from the edges of the room, and he still had not moved. He kept returning to Adrian, to the relief on his face the night Vivian walked out, to the pacing in the room above, to the way he flinched at official posts, to the expression he wore whenever Vivian's name was mentioned, which was somewhere between guilt and gratitude and a desperation not to be seen feeling either. Alfred rose at dawn, dressed without calling for his valet, and went downstairs with the purposeful energy of a man who has finally decided to open a door he has been circling for months. He was halfway down the corridor toward the east study when he saw a thin line of smoke visible beneath the door of the private sitting room that adjoined Adrian's quarters. He opened the door without knocking. Adrian was crouched beside the fireplace, feeding papers into the flame. He was moving quickly, with the focused desperation of someone in the middle of erasing something. 3 papers were already burning. A 4th was in his hand. He looked up when the door opened. The color left his face so completely and so immediately that Alfred stood still for a moment, simply watching, because the expression on his brother's face was providing him with an extraordinary amount of information. "What are those?" Alfred said. Adrian rose. He was gripping the unburned paper with both hands. "Nothing. Old correspondence." I was clearing. Alfred crossed the room in 4 steps and took the paper from his brother's hand before Adrian had time to decide whether to give it or burn it. He looked at it for a long time. It was partial. One half had caught the edge of the flame and been damaged, but enough remained. Royal seals, military correspondence, language describing political arrangements that had no business existing in a private sitting room or anywhere outside the offices of a crown tribunal. And there, in the upper margin, in Adrian's unmistakable handwriting, his own name. The room was very quiet. "When did this happen?" Alfred said. It was not a question. It was the beginning of a reckoning. Adrian sat down heavily on the edge of the chair. And then, in broken pieces the way the truth tends to come when it has been held in long enough, it all came out. The noble circle, the documents, the prince, the arrangement, and Vivian, who had come to Adrian after discovering the danger through a channel Alfred would never have anticipated, who had listened to his brother's panic with a steadiness Alfred now understood was characteristic rather than coincidental, and who had then, quietly and alone, constructed an entire sacrifice so that the family she was about to join would remain intact. She had let herself be destroyed. She had manufactured a scandal. I walked into one. Let it consume her publicly. Let the court decide what it wanted to decide about her character, her morals, her choices. Let Alfred believe what he was apparently willing to believe, that the woman who had loved him would betray him without explanation, because telling him the truth would have put Adrian in front of a crown tribunal and Alfred in the position of either protecting a traitor or losing his brother. She had made the choice so that Alfred wouldn't have to. "She only asked one thing of me," Adrian said. His voice had dropped very low. He was looking at the floor. "She asked that you never find out." Alfred was very still for a very long time. Then he put the paper down on the mantelpiece, turned away from the fireplace, and stood facing the window with his back to the room. Adrian said his name. Alfred said nothing. He stood there until he was certain he had control of his breathing and his hands and his expression. Then he turned around, looked at his brother with an expression that Adrian would describe to people for the rest of his life as the most frightening thing he had ever seen on a human face, and said, very quietly, "Get out of this house. Tonight. I will arrange the details in the morning, But you are going to spend the next 2 years learning what it means to live with the consequences of decisions you made for other people to bear. And you will not set foot in Paris society until I believe you have." Adrian did not argue. He did not protest. He had been waiting for this, at some level, for 3 years. He packed that evening. Alfred returned to his study, sat down at his desk, and spent a long time alone with what he now knew. She had sacrificed her reputation, her engagement, her social standing, her presence in the city she had lived in her entire life. 3 years of exile and silence, and starting over in a world that had decided to be unkind to her, all of it to protect a family that responded by publicly abandoning her. All of it to protect him. He struck the desk once, hard enough to crack the wood. Then he stood up, went to the stables, ordered his horse saddled, and rode out into the freezing rain. He arrived at her estate soaked through and breathing unevenly, which was not the dignified arrival he would have preferred, but was, under the circumstances, exactly what the moment deserved. The servants looked startled when they opened the door. He asked for Vivian. The footman disappeared. Alfred stood in the entrance hall dripping onto the marble floor, which would normally have bothered him and tonight did not register at all. She appeared at the top of the stairs in a pale blue dress, holding a small lamp, her dark hair loose around her shoulders in a way he had almost never seen. It was the middle of the night, and he had arrived unannounced, and she was clearly not prepared for company. She stopped when she saw his face. Something in her expression shifted immediately. Not surprising. Something closer to the resignation of someone who has always known that the reckoning was eventually going to arrive. She descended the stairs slowly. She set the lamp on the hall table. She looked at him. "You spoke with Adrian," she said. It was not a question. Alfred had arrived with a great deal of prepared speech and discovered, now that he was standing in front of her, that none of it was adequate. "Why," he said. "Just that. One word, stripped of everything except the honest weight of not understanding." Vivian moved into the small sitting room off the hall. He followed. She sat. He did not. The lamp on the mantelpiece made the room feel very close and very honest. "Why did you protect them?" he said. "Why did you protect me? When you knew I would believe the worst. When you had no guarantee that I would not simply do exactly what I did." "I didn't do it because I had a guarantee," she said. "I did it because Adrian was terrified and nobody else was going to. He was terrified because he was careless and foolish and signed his name to something he didn't fully understand." "Yes, that was not your burden to carry." "No," she said, "it wasn't. But the alternative was watching your family be destroyed, and I wasn't able to make myself choose that." He crossed the room and sat down across from her. Up close, in the lamplight, he could see the steadiness in her face, the same steadiness that had been there in the ballroom 3 years ago, that had been there every time he had encountered her this season, that had apparently been there through 3 years of everything that followed. "I should have asked you," he said, "before any of it. I should have come to you privately and asked, and I didn't." "No," she agreed. "I chose what I could see over what I should have trusted." "Yes, and you chose to carry the consequences of my cowardice along with everything else." Vivian was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was measured and careful in the way of someone who has decided that clarity matters more than softness. "I was not entirely without fault. I made my choices without telling you. I decided I knew better than to give you the information and trust you with it. That was not fair either. We both failed each other, Alfred. The difference is that only one of us walked away from it. The accuracy of this was so complete that he had no defense against it. I came here to ask you to." He stopped, started again. "I came here to ask if there is any possibility." "I am engaged to Henry," she said, gently, firmly. "I know, and I am happy, genuinely. Not as a performance for your benefit, not to cause you pain. I am simply happy. He is kind and steady, and he has never once made me feel like a liability." Alfred absorbed this. It felt like pressing on a bruise, with full knowledge of what you were doing. "I understand," he said. "Do you actually?" He looked at her for a long moment. "I think so. I think I'm beginning to. 3 years in. The smallest of pauses. Better late than never, perhaps." Vivian looked at him. Something moved across her face, not reconciliation, not forgiveness in any transactional sense, but the particular warmth of someone who has genuinely wished you well from a distance and means it. You are a good man, Alfred, when you are not terrified one. The Crown has reason to trust you. I hope you find, in time, someone who makes you less terrified. He stood. He straightened his coat. I hope Henry knows what he has, he said. He does, she said, simply, without vanity, as a statement of fact. He nodded once, and for the first time since she had returned to Paris, he looked at her, without the desperate pull of regret coloring everything, just a clear-eyed recognition of what was, and what had been lost, and what could not be reclaimed. Take care of yourself, Vivian. You as well. He walked out into the rain. It was still coming down, cold and steady. He mounted his horse and rode through it without hurrying, and did not feel the cold in the way he had expected to. Spring arrived in Paris, with the particular extravagance of a season that has made you wait for it long enough. The city bloomed overnight, or that was how it always felt. One morning you woke up and the gray was gone, and the light had warmth in it again, and people moved through the streets with slightly more velocity than they had all winter. Vivian was leaving. She had said her goodbyes over the preceding 2 weeks, with the unhurried grace of someone who had made her peace with this chapter of her life, and was stepping into the next one with both hands open. Grace had spent most of their final dinner together alternating between crying and insisting she was not crying, which Vivian had managed with enormous fondness, and only one gentle reminder that Vienna was not actually the ends of the earth. You will write, Grace said, for the 4th time that evening. Every week, Vivian said, for the 4th time. More often if something interesting happens. Something interesting always happens to you. It does, Vivian agreed. I've decided to find this charming rather than alarming. Grace had laughed finally, and hugged her for a long time, and told her that she deserved every good thing that was waiting for her in Vienna, and Vivian had held on to her cousin's hands and thought about how gratitude, when it was genuine, didn't require very many words. Her father saw her off at the house with the quiet dignity of a man who had watched his daughter navigate something terrible and come out the other side not diminished but deepened. He did not make speeches. He held her face in his hands for a moment, looked at her very directly, and said, simply, I am proud of you. She carried that with her. The morning of departure was extraordinarily clear and bright and cold-edged in the pleasant way of early spring. The sky, that particular shade of blue that only exists before the day has fully warmed up. Henry was already on the dock when her carriage arrived, managing the last of the luggage arrangements with the efficient cheerfulness of a man who was deeply happy about where he was going. He spotted her carriage, excused himself from the shipping agent he'd been speaking with, and crossed the dock with the unhurried confidence of someone who knew he had all the time he needed. He opened the carriage door himself. Ready? He asked. His voice was warm, and his eyes were the specific kind of bright that had nothing to do with the morning light. Completely, she said. He helped her down, kept her hand, and didn't let go. On the ship's deck, as Paris receded behind them, the spires and the rooftops and the gray-gold light of a city that had given her both the best and some of the most difficult years of her life, Henry stood beside her and wrapped a warm cloak around her shoulders without being asked. She was quiet for a moment, watching the shoreline. Do you miss it? He asked. She thought about this seriously, the way she approached most things that deserved a serious answer. She thought about the gilded arch, the silver tray, the sound a diamond ring makes against silver in a silent ballroom. She thought about 3 years of starting over, of rebuilding something that had been taken apart, of discovering, in the rebuilding, that she was considerably stronger than she had known. She thought about the carriage in the snow, the lamplight in the sitting room, the honesty of that final conversation, and the clean, uncomplicated grief of closing a door on something that had run its course. She thought about Grace, who would write every week, and probably more. She thought about her father's hands on her face. She thought about the particular quality of London morning light, which she had a feeling she was going to miss at inopportune moments for the rest of her life. She thought about Henry, standing beside her without needing to be anywhere else, his shoulder warm against hers. She laughed softly. It surprised him slightly. Parts of it, she said honestly, but I am more interested in what's ahead. He reached into the pocket of his coat and produced a small velvet box. She had not been expecting it. She thought she had an excellent read on him by now, but he had a talent for these quiet moments, for choosing exactly the right one without ceremony or performance. Inside was a ring simple and brilliant, a deep emerald set in gold, nothing like the diamond that had once made such a clear sound against a silver tray. "I know we have been engaged since winter," he said, with the slightly self-conscious directness of someone who has rehearsed and then decided to abandon the rehearsed version. "But I wanted this to be the one you remembered, on a morning like this." Moving forward, she looked at the ring for a moment. Then she looked at him, and for the first time in a very long time, not since before the ballroom, not since before the rain, not since before she had learned what it cost to love someone who was too frightened to trust, she felt something settle in her completely. Not relief, not the absence of pain. Something positive and full and entirely its own thing. Peace. "Yes," she said. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. She leaned into him, his arm around her, the wind moving through her hair, the city behind them and the open water ahead. She did not look back. Adrien was sent to a small agricultural estate in the south of France with a modest allowance and a very clear understanding that he would not return to Paris society until Alfred was satisfied that he had learned something. He spent the first month feeling very sorry for himself, which was expected. He spent the following months discovering that real work, the kind done with your hands and your time, and without anyone to manage the consequences on your behalf, had a way of producing clarity that no amount of privilege ever could. He wrote to Alfred at 6 months. Then in a year. The letters got better as they went. By the end of 2 years, Alfred had begun to believe them. Alfred kept everything he had built: the title, the estate, the crown's trust, the influence he had worked toward for years. He lost nothing that could be itemized or listed or measured. He sat with that for a long time before he understood that it was not actually a comfort. A grand estate with no one in it who genuinely knows you is a very elegant and very empty thing. He did not spiral. That is worth noting. He made no dramatic gestures. He did not disappear into grief or bitterness. He went back to work. He did his duty. He was good at it, and being good at it kept him steady when other things did not. But sometimes, in the winter evenings, when the fire was low and the house was quiet, he thought about a pale woman in a cream gown placing a diamond ring onto a silver tray with the composure of someone who had already forgiven him before he finished speaking. And he sat with it fully, honestly, without trying to argue himself out of it, because some lessons only take root when you stop trying to avoid them. He became, slowly, more careful, more willing to ask questions before making conclusions, more aware of what it costs to mistake efficiency for wisdom. Whether any of it made him a better man was not for him to determine. It would be for whoever came next to decide. And Vivian? Vivian arrived in Vienna in the spring and found that it suited her. The city was beautiful in an unhurried way. All architecture and concert halls, and the particular cultural seriousness of a place that took its pleasures intentionally. Henry introduced her to a life built around genuine affection, honest communication, and the profound relief of being loved by someone who asked questions before drawing conclusions. She made friends, real ones, the kind that take time to develop and require nothing from you but your actual self. She continued the charitable work she had begun during her years of exile. She had discovered, and having very little social power, a deep respect for people who operated entirely outside the currency of status, and she carried that discovery with her into her new life. She laughed more. She slept well. She woke up in the mornings and felt, with a consistency that still occasionally surprised her, glad. That gladness, simple, earned, belonging entirely to her, was the best thing she had ever built. This is a story about sacrifice, but it is equally a story about the difference between noble sacrifice and self-erasure, and why that difference matters. Vivian's choice to protect Adrien, and through him Alfred's family, was made from love, but it was also made in isolation, without giving the person she loved the chance to be better than she assumed he would be. She decided, on his behalf, that he could not be trusted with the truth. In that decision, she denied him the opportunity to prove her wrong. The lesson is not that her sacrifice was wrong. The lesson is that love which requires you to disappear is not a sustainable love, and recognizing that early, before you have erased yourself in service of someone else's comfort, is among the most important things a person can learn. Alfred's failure was not that he chose his family. It was that he chose what he could see over what he should have trusted. He had every piece of information necessary to ask a single question, and he did not ask it. The fear of scandal became more real to him than the woman standing in front of him, and that choice, made in seconds, produced 3 years of consequence that no apology could fully undo. This is the territory of cognitive bias specifically, the human tendency to confirm the story we are most afraid of, rather than the one most worth investigating. When fear or pride is driving, we often take the path of least emotional risk. We believe the rumor. We accept the easy explanation. We step back instead of stepping closer. And sometimes, by the time we understand what we have done, the person we did it to has simply moved on and built something better. That is not a punishment. It is just the natural result of time continuing to move while we are standing still. A final word before we close. Hey, quick question. How are you feeling right now? If Vivian's story sat with you, if some part of it felt personal, felt familiar, felt like something you needed to hear, then this channel is exactly where you belong. We create stories like this because we believe the most powerful kind of entertainment is the kind that leaves you knowing something you didn't know before you sat down. So if this story moved you, please hit that subscribe button right now. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. I will personally say hello back because I genuinely want to know how far this story has traveled and who it found along the way. Subscribe to see how Vivian's journey unfolds across our full library, and leave a comment so I can find you. Thank you sincerely for spending this time here. Vivian Miller's story is, at its heart, a story about what integrity costs and what it ultimately earns. She walked out of that ballroom holding a secret that would have saved her reputation and destroyed her. She kept it because she understood, at a level deeper than pride, that some things matter more than being seen to be right. And the world did not immediately reward her for that. It rarely does. The world gave her 3 years of exile and silence, and starting over before it gave her a morning on a ship, a ring the color of new leaves, and a man who asked questions before drawing conclusions. That gap between the sacrifice and the reward is where character is built, not in the easy moments, not in the moments when virtue is comfortable, but in the long stretch of ordinary days when nobody is watching, and the temptation to simply give up on being the person you decided to be is at its most convincing. Vivian held on, and she arrived. Keep your chin up, no matter what whispers are trailing behind you. Until next time, take care of yourself, stay safe, and have a beautiful day.